Next on Secrets of War, the hidden factors behind the first conflict of the Cold War. Newly discovered documents reveal Stalin's influence over China's Mao Zedong and Korea's Kim Il-sung. The intelligence failures of MacArthur's most trusted aides and the strings being pulled by the world's two superpowers. Korea, behind the bamboo curtain, is next on Secrets of War.
The 38th parallel, still a world divided. Hostility and landmines continue to separate the ever-watchful North and South Koreans. Though fighting ceased more than 45 years ago, no permanent peace treaty marked the end of the Korean War. Today, nations of the world conduct amphibious exercises in South Korea to prepare against another possible conflict. The elusive goal of unification, which drew millions to their deaths in this unforgiving terrain, may never be realized. In a small town in North Korea in 1949, a young medical student, indoctrinated daily with Russian communist dogma, wondered why he was forced to practice killing Caucasians with bayonets.
Every morning, all
the students were given bayonets made of wood. Then we had dummies made of straw. They were American, Caucasian men. We were supposed to stick our bayonets through the dummy's face and heart area.
Wow! Kill American.
Isolated from the rest of the world, Donald Chung was unaware of how dictators were conspiring in ways which would directly change his life and all those who fought and died in Korea forever.
Only in the last few years has it become possible to begin to see what the communist powers actually thought about, why they did what they did. Many people have compared it to the first view of the far side of the moon.
Scholars have spent years exploring the dark secrets hidden in Soviet archives. Joseph Stalin directed hundreds of wartime telegrams to Kim Il-sung, ruler of North Korea, and to Mao Zedong, leader of the People's Republic of China. In Beijing, though archives have been less accessible, secrets from behind the bamboo curtain can still be uncovered.
I got my information from many internally circulated party documents, and especially Mao Zedong's telegrams.
These critical revelations help to explain what student Chung observed about the scope of early unseen Soviet and Chinese involvement in North Korea. How was the world pushed to the brink of war just 5 years after World War II? Stalin felt that a number of changing international factors were creating opportunities for the expansion of Soviet communism. After their defeat in World War II, the occupying Japanese were removed from Korea. Divided at the 38th parallel by Truman and Stalin, Stalin occupied the industrial north. The U.S., under the new United Nations, took custody of the agricultural south. Reunification of the two hostile countries and democratic elections were discussed, but later rejected. American and Russian troops were removed by 1949, leaving a Soviet-trained North Korean army opposite the much weaker South Koreans. A secret Soviet atomic test in August 1949 persuaded Stalin that he could soon challenge the United States. In southern Asia, Mao's People's Liberation Army had soundly routed Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists from the mainland. Japan's recent atrocities throughout China's cities, like Nanking, pushed Mao to complete his revolution to reunify China. To protect against any future foreign invaders, he would have to conquer China's strategic offshore islands, including Taiwan. But would those vital territories be defended by the Soviet Union or the United States? Mao had to find out who was friend or foe. First stop, Moscow in December 1949. In this only face-to-face meeting between the two communist rivals, recorded by Russian cameras, Stalin rudely kept Mao cooling his heels between meetings, once for more than 2 weeks in Moscow's winter. Mao's notes reveal he was incensed.
He wanted to sign a treaty of alliance with the Soviet Union. However, now, according to the new documents, Stalin disappointed Mao greatly.
Another opportunity arose in Washington when Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, announced that the Korean Peninsula was not within the defense perimeter of the United States. This U.S. retreat from the Asian mainland echoed and re-echoed in Moscow, Beijing, and in Pyongyang, North Korea.
Acheson's National Press Club speech of January 12, 1950, was perhaps a signal, a go-ahead signal, unintended, but a go-ahead signal nonetheless to Stalin to give his approval to North Korean leader Kim Il-sung.
The Chinese actually very quickly caught the message that it seemed to him the Americans were not ready to involve themselves in a major war caused by domestic revolution in Asia.
It's a classic example of giving the enemy, the potential enemy, the wrong impression, and by doing that, encouraging him into an attack which lands you both in a war that neither of you want.
If Acheson had included South Korea in the American defense perimeter in the Pacific, it's highly unlikely that there would have been a war at that time.
His winter game of cat and mouse with Mao completed, Stalin raised the stakes again. He secretly encouraged Mao to provide more aid to Ho Chi Minh, ruler of North Vietnam, in his guerrilla war against the French. In Japan, the Communist Party was becoming more militant. If Soviet communism was to dominate this turbulent world, Stalin determined it was Korea's turn. He finally agreed to Kim Il-sung's incessant pleas to let him attack the South. If Kim could force unification on the weaker South after a short war, as he promised, Soviet communism could spread further into Asia.
Stalin has said that he approves the concept of invading South Korea, or of moving toward unification, as he puts it, because of the, quote, changed international situation. He writes this in a cable to Mao Zedong on May 13th, 1950, to inform Mao that he approves this concept, conditional on Kim Il-sung also obtaining Chinese approval.
Kim somehow convinced Stalin that the war would be over in less than 30 days. A popular uprising in the South would help the cause. The Americans, he reasoned, could not rally quickly enough with sufficient troops so far from home.
And so there's this very complicated interaction between Kim and Stalin and Mao, and between all of them in their perceptions of the West and the U.S. resolve. We can't get inside Stalin's head, which would be a scary place to go in any case.
In early June of 1950, student Chung took note of still more clandestine Soviet involvement.
The Russian military advisor at the Security Council asked Major Chu to translate 7 or 8 pages of a military document from Russian into Korean. All the instructions were on this document.
The entire secret Soviet attack plan was then distributed to the North Korean divisions just before Kim Il-sung launched his surprise invasion across the 38th parallel. Neither U.S. nor British intelligence could pick up the enemy's covert attack information. Russian and North Korean communications officers rarely used telephones or signals. Fearing the betrayal of secrets, every order was primitively carried by hand, officer to officer. To provide terrain for the mobilization of Soviet tanks and thousands of soldiers, towns were quietly being evacuated from the area above the 38th parallel. This movement was misinterpreted by U.S. intelligence as an agricultural experiment. As public diversion, Kim Il-sung's propaganda machine called for unifying elections and peace proposals. Not far away in Tokyo, life was more relaxed. Overseeing the rebuilding of post-war Japan from his headquarters, General Douglas MacArthur discounted the reports that North Koreans might attack. The stage was set in late June 1950. President Harry Truman was spending a long weekend in Independence, Missouri. Joseph Stalin plotted in the Kremlin. Mao Zedong, preparing to invade Taiwan, was not notified by Kim Il-sung that the invasion would occur that weekend. General MacArthur was outlining his negotiation points for the upcoming Japanese peace treaty. In Washington, the classified CIA estimate that activity along the border signified a potential attack from the North Koreans lay unheeded. At 4 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, the 25th of June, 1950, artillery barrages thundered through the rainy pre-dawn darkness. President Truman acted swiftly and ordered General MacArthur to defend South Korea with air and naval forces out of Tokyo. As he contacted his allies, the president wondered if World War III had just begun. Because they feared a Soviet attack in Europe, the British could only spare a single carrier group from the Royal Navy. Some members of parliament also cautioned against alienating a potential trading partner in Mao Zedong. With Within 2 days, President Truman demonstrated that he did not agree.
When President Truman ordered the 7th Fleet to enter the Taiwan Straits, and the Chinese leaders at that time should have understood that they had underestimated American intention and capacity in the Far East.
Uniting China, not Korea, was Mao's highest priority. His revolutionary plans were immediately thwarted by Kim Il-sung's secret invasion and by Truman's decisive reaction to it.
Shortly after the outbreak of the Korean War, the Beijing leadership had made extensive preparation for entering the war. If they had not been Mao, maybe there would never have been the Chinese decision to enter the war.
In the Beijing debate, Mao had to indefinitely postpone his plans to invade Taiwan. Instead, he had to make preparations to defend his Korean borders. Stalin had solidified his potential rival as a new partner. But in this cabal, the third conspirator, Kim Il-sung, had his own political goals, which were not exactly disclosed in the telegrams he'd communicated to the sponsoring Soviets. Once the invasion of the South began, Kim mysteriously brushed aside the original Russian attack plan. To unite a distant region which he regarded as favorable to him, Kim carelessly diverted an entire reinforced division away from its proposed military target of Pusan. Left short-handed, the reckless Kim could not bring the full destructive force of his troops against the limited American defenders at their weakest.
The North Koreans could have won the war in the first part of the summer of 1950. By that time, the United States had got just enough forces ashore to hold the ring. He'd missed his big chance. So in a way, Kim Il-sung was his own worst enemy in the opening.
When the Republic of South Korea was attacked by the North, President Truman immediately turned to the United Nations. The invading North Koreans were branded as aggressors. Any one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council could have vetoed this ruling and thereby changed the course of history on the 25th of June, 1950. Continuing to protest the ceding of nationalist China months earlier, the Soviet ambassador did not attend on Stalin's orders. It was a monumental Soviet mistake.
It was absolutely crucial that the Soviet member was not in the Security Council, and there could not have been a UN flag on the operation in Korea.
As part of the UN resolution, which passed without the expected Russian veto, General MacArthur was designated Supreme Commander.
MacArthur was old on the job. He had with him a staff that largely came with him from Bataan. His intelligence officer, Charles Willoughby, was a man who knew exactly what MacArthur wanted to hear and played to him.
But MacArthur had not gained the full respect of America's principal ally, the British.
The British always thought MacArthur had more wind than substance and never trusted MacArthur's military judgments. He was regarded as very much a loose cannon.
During the summer of 1950, the Allies were in extreme danger. North Korean offensives pushed them into a less than 50-mile perimeter around Pusan. If the UN forces were pushed entirely off the peninsula, it might be impossible to mount an invasion from the sea. MacArthur demanded more troops and supplies, hoping to buy time. Then he reached into his triumphant past to grasp a plan for the future, a daring amphibious landing reminiscent of his campaigns in the Pacific.
MacArthur's design was an ordinary war plan from the time of McClellan and the Civil War, and so his desire to cut off the Korean troops was perfectly orthodox. Landing at Incheon wasn't.
To gain the offensive, MacArthur wanted to attack the enemy deep on its northwesternmost flank, splitting its forces. To do so would require a very hazardous landing on the cliffs of Incheon, near Seoul. The critical window of opportunity for a landing would be a few short hours.
The Chinese General Staff reported to Mao and Zhou Enlai in person that it was possible that the UN forces would try to make an amphibious landing in the rear of the Korean forces. And both Mao and Zhou did convey this warning to North Korean leaders.
It would appear that Kim Il-sung greatly underrated the potential of an amphibious landing. Mao had tried to warn him, but Kim was monomanic. Kim was determined to press on in a sort of emotional, romantic hope almost that he could unify the peninsula before the landing occurred.
But Kim Il-sung would pay a price for his continued defiance of good advice. On the 15th of September, 1950, MacArthur's 1st Marine and 7th U.S. Infantry Divisions embarked on their dangerous mission to Incheon. The first of these 18,000 troops scaled the cliffs during the critical 3-hour window of high tide. The Marines met very light resistance from the unprepared North Korean troops. The UN goals were to seize control of the nearby Kimpo airfield, to force the communists from the South Korean capital of Seoul, 10 miles inland, and finally to drive southward to link up with other forces pushing north from Busan. If the plan worked, the North Koreans below the 38th parallel would be destroyed.
The Incheon landing symbolized MacArthur's audacity, his willingness to take risks, and his ability, in fact, in some cases, to carry out an operation brilliantly. But the big thing to remember was the tremendous impact it had on his stature at home in the United States.
So overwhelming was MacArthur's triumph that President Truman, conferring with Defense Secretary George Marshall, agreed to fly more than halfway around the globe to share the limelight with his victorious general on Wake Island 4 weeks later. Incheon signified that the Americans meant business. It also meant, according to recently declassified telegrams, that an enraged Stalin was prepared to jettison Kim Il-sung. When the triumphant South Korean army pursued the retreating North across the 38th parallel on the 1st of October, Mao, pressured by a desperate Stalin, sent a message to the Soviet leader on October 2nd, stating he would not intervene. Mao was playing cat to Stalin's mouse. If Mao was going to send Chinese troops into Korea, he wanted Stalin's air support to protect them. Late that night, Mao sent a critical message through his foreign minister, Zhou Enlai, to the Indian ambassador, K.M. Panikkar. in Beijing. Mao expected it to be immediately forwarded to the Allies. It was. The message stated that if American troops follow the South Korean forces across the 38th parallel, China will intervene.
And the decision was made in a very complicated situation because we now know that just hours before Zhou Enlai met with Panica, the Chinese leadership experienced a tremendous debate about if China should enter the Korean War. And then Zhou Enlai sent the message.
Truman was concerned the Indian ambassador Panikkar was being manipulated by the Chinese. Truman decided to ignore the message. But the same message triggered a second debate in English-speaking capitals, where they perceived that the Chinese, with their overwhelming numbers, were stirring.
The UN allies, America and Britain in particular, said to themselves and to one another, if we do not follow up the North Koreans, surely all that is going to happen is that the Russians will give them more supplies, and in a year, 2 or 3 years, they'll be back where they were before, with new armies.
Meanwhile, at the United Nations, a third debate about unification of the peninsula festered. Between Moscow and Beijing, strange telegrams were furiously passed in code.
The most dramatic of these is around the time of Chinese intervention in the war, where Stalin urgently almost pleads with Mao to intervene in October 1950 to save Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans, even at the risk, and this is explicitly discussed, of starting World War III.
The CIA had not been listening closely. Their classified documents projected that the Soviets and the Chinese would not intervene directly at that time.
The Americans were basing their predictions on the idea that Stalin was not willing to risk World War III in the fall of 1950.
In one telegram from Mao to Filippov, one code name for Stalin, another scenario emerged. Chinese intervention in the war could lead to a U.S.-China conflict. The Russians would then have to defend their ally, who was also their rival. Would they?
Stalin responds that it's unlikely that the Americans will risk World War III, and even if they did, need we fear this? Because, Stalin tells Mao, you and we together are stronger than the Americans and the British, and if World War III is inevitable, better that it happen now in 1950 than years later when Japan and Western Germany will have rebuilt their armed forces and be able to contribute to the Western military alliance.
Truman must have foreseen that eventuality. To demonstrate American resolve after the June invasion, Truman implemented deliberate steps to surround Asia and the Soviet Union with stronger allies. As part of his containment, he soon brought General Dwight Eisenhower out of retirement and entrusted NATO to him. Yet pressure was also on Truman from the upcoming congressional elections. Senator Joseph McCarthy challenged those who were allegedly soft on communism. Though he could have stopped General MacArthur, Truman allowed the 1st Cavalry Division to cross the 38th parallel on the 8th of October.
Now, Mao Zedong actually sent orders to his commander, Peng Dehuai, in Manchuria on October 8th to send troops into Korea.
But then Mao changed his mind.
And suddenly on October the 12th, Mao ordered the halt of all movement. And we now know that is because Mao got information from Zhou Enlai, who was at that time in the Soviet Union to meet Stalin that the Soviet Union would not provide a proper air cover.
Mao Zedong then had a nervous breakdown. He was incommunicado, apart from his closest assistants, for over 48 hours.
Mao finally emerged to reinstate his order to his commander, Peng Dehuai. But his feelings toward Stalin had changed forever. Stalin had betrayed the Chinese Communist Revolution. Now irrevocably trapped by circumstance, Mao continued to negotiate with his uncertain partner Stalin for an air force. On the 15th of October, Commander-in-Chief Truman arrived on Wake Island to greet General MacArthur. The two had never met. MacArthur had spent the last 14 years in the Pacific.
The purpose of the Wake Island meeting was political. His White House staff thought it would be good for the president to be seen with a victorious commander in war.
MacArthur came away from this first presidential meeting believing he'd been given a free hand. He'd convinced Truman that the boys would be home by Thanksgiving. MacArthur flatly discounted the Chinese threat, predicting the greatest slaughter by his forces. As they parted, both men shared a sense of confidence that the war would soon be over. But as Truman left, he noted that the general had not saluted him. The commander-in-chief was shocked by MacArthur's lack of respect. Neither man had heard the predictions of another American general, more sensitive to honest intelligence estimates about Chinese troops on the Yalu River, who said, "The boys had better eat a lot of turkey by Thanksgiving because their stomachs are going to be filled with Chinese bullets." In fact, battalions of Chinese soldiers were already slipping unnoticed across the border from Manchuria. MacArthur's boys would arrive home, many in boxes or strapped on gurneys aboard hospital ships. In October 1950, medical student Chung was told by his chief surgeon that the North Koreans would eventually lose the war. Chung decided he would soon desert the North and fight against his country for the South. Meanwhile, in Beijing, Mao was devising his recently revealed strategic plans against the American imperialist aggressor.
Mao also mentioned that MacArthur was so arrogant. Sooner or later, he will make a mistake. And Mao said, we will wait until he make his mistake. He would overextend his own capacity, and finally, he would provide the Chinese with the possibility to defeat him.
Fresh from the heady wine of Incheon, General MacArthur plotted new offensives far above the 38th parallel. He stretched his troops up to the Yalu River, to the very edge of China's Manchurian border. He was convinced he could defeat Mao's primitive forces. Truman also felt secure. He had atomic weapons, and he had demonstrated his willingness to use them to end the bloodshed of World War II.
And actually, the question of Mao's attitude toward the atomic bomb was not a new issue. So reasons he tried to use to convince the Chinese people that why they should not be scared by atomic bomb. Why? Because you have to remember there's also the Soviet bomb. If the Americans try to use a bomb to deal with China, and then they will have to prepare for a possible Soviet retaliation against them.
You could find in the documents an indication that some U.S. officials were concerned. How would it look to the rest of the world and our allies in Western Europe to use this bomb on Asians again for the second time in less than a decade?
Mao believed that he had no control on what the Americans planned to do. He was very clear about this. However, he did believe that if the Americans were willing to use the bomb and deal with China, and certainly China was not in the worst position to accept it. But that is simply because he believed that for the sake of serving his sacred cause of continuous revolution, the sacrifice in human life is more than necessary.
Yet, once again, near the Yalu River, MacArthur's intelligence team miscalculated.
Charles Willoughby, the G2 commander in Tokyo, knew that MacArthur did not want anything to interfere with his final offensive in Korea. He did not want any kind of intelligence to emerge that might lead Washington, for example, to change his orders. Now, we don't know for sure that Willoughby willfully, knowingly falsified his intelligence.
Where substantial evidence existed that small units of 300,000 Chinese were spilling down from the Yalu River, Willoughby's figure was a mere 60,000.
Had we taken Chow's warning more seriously in October, I think we would have been much more restrictive in terms of our operations in North Korea, and we would not have extended ourselves so widely into those northern provinces.
The Allies shared other fears about proceeding too far north.
There is this deep suspicion on the part of the Brits that MacArthur is going to escalate the war, going to reopen the Chinese Civil War, something that Britain couldn't possibly support.
Contact with the Chinese Communist Army occurred on the 25th of October. It was the first in a series of Mao Zedong's carefully laid traps, as recently revealed through his deciphered telegrams. Over the next 7 days, hordes of Chinese destroyed thousands of South Korean troops. Supplies and ammunition could not reach UN troops because of snow, ice, and freezing temperatures. Allied forces under MacArthur suffered one of the worst defeats in recent military history. Then the winter of 1950, one of the worst on record, engaged his soldiers. Winter 1. Severely endangered and desperate, MacArthur threatened to widen the war against the tens of thousands of Chinese mobilizing in their protected sanctuary, Manchuria. Earlier, he had even suggested the creation of a vast radioactive barrier along the Chinese border. His actions angered the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Commander-in-Chief. Meanwhile, military aides noted that MacArthur was writing private messages to the press to protect himself. Taught the arts of entrapment and manipulation by his co-conspirator Stalin, Mao ensnared MacArthur.
Mao made the kind of comments in November and December 1950 when the Chinese forces prepared troops to lure the UN forces to march forward. And Mao actually at that point demonstrated himself to be a great strategist.
In medical student Donald Chung's hometown, rampaging North Korean soldiers wantonly killed civilians who had once aided their underground activities. They could leave no witnesses. Chung was asked to identify some of the bodies. In a roadside ditch, he examined the carnage. One of the victims was his aunt. He then told his mother he had to leave North Korea, but that he would return in 3 days. To save his own life, he chose to follow the retreating UN army.
All the way down, it was snowing heavily, and the road was all slippery. Oxen-driven carts slipped down the side of the road. The cows could not climb back from the ditch. The army came and just shot at anybody. We retreated more and more to South Korea. There, more people joined us. Some people could not follow because of old age or frostbite or sore feet, and they were limping, just miserable. We did not have time to eat. We walked for almost 1 week.
On the 12th of December, Chung arrived in South Korea for the first time and enlisted in its army. His enemy was not Caucasian, as he'd been taught years earlier in bayonet practice. Now he confronted his own countrymen and the Chinese. In spite of overwhelming technology, UN forces risked being pushed off the peninsula altogether for the second time at Hungnam. Strategists calculated that the UN situation was more perilous than it had been when the North Koreans invaded just 6 months earlier. In Europe, the British and the other allies could not accept a nuclear scenario, no matter how hypothetical. When atomic trial balloons leaked from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and from a White House press briefing, the Allies immediately asked British Prime Minister Clement Attlee to visit the president. They feared American rashness.
Hence the absolute horror when President Truman appears to be saying, A, we're willing to use nuclear weapons in Korea, and even worse, the local commander, that is, this loose cannon MacArthur, is the person who might make the decision. A mushroom cloud wasn't going to appear over Washington if nuclear weapons were used in Korea, but it might well appear over London.
There were those in Washington who were saying that if World War III is inevitable, better that it happen now rather than years later when the Soviets have a deliverable nuclear weapons arsenal.
A mere 6 months into the war, Attlee obtained assurances from Truman that the atomic bomb would not be used. To maintain contingency plans, simulated atomic attacks on North Korea's capital were conducted. Then in spring of 1951, B-29s delivered 9 atomic bombs to the island of Guam. In April 1951, Truman felt that the air war around Manchuria might have to be expanded, particularly if the Chinese conducted their spring offensive as anticipated. Now that the Soviets had introduced MiG fighters into the air war, they might intervene more directly, providing air cover for the battlefield. Douglas MacArthur had repeatedly challenged civilian control of the limited war. To some international embassies, he privately indicated he could dispose of the Chinese Communist question completely with, quote, nuclear attacks, unquote. Truman viewed these secret intercepted messages as treachery, confirming his feeling that he could no longer trust MacArthur. On April 11th, 1950, President Truman relieved General MacArthur of his last command. While cheers echoed in the canyons of New York, In Beijing, Mao's prophecy was fulfilled. General Matthew Ridgway, MacArthur's replacement, now planned his own offensives together with General James Van Fleet. The retaking of Seoul had already begun to inspire the demoralized troops. But in spite of the bloody battles at hills like Heartbreak Ridge, T-Bone, and Old Baldy, the campaign ground to a halt. After weeks of political maneuvering, the first attempts at peace talks were finally held at Kaesong, very close to the 38th parallel, on the 10th of July, 1951. They dragged on for over 2 years, during which time tens of thousands more soldiers died. The issue of repatriation of prisoners of war occupied the central battlefield of proposals, counter-proposals, and propaganda. The sputtering peace talks might have dragged on indefinitely, except for 2 occurrences. First, General Eisenhower was elected President of the United States in 1952.
I shall go to Korea.
Again, the possible use of atomic weapons was threatened to bring the war to a conclusion. In their memoirs, Eisenhower and Richard Nixon point to the successful use of nuclear blackmail to force the Chinese and the North Koreans to sign. The more significant event was the death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953. But new revelations emerged from the secret archives. Both Stalin and Mao wanted to end the war before the nuclear threat was issued. More than 3 years after it had begun, hostilities in the Korean War ended on the 27th of July, 1953. A temporary ceasefire was signed, but a permanent peace treaty was never agreed to.
We have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world.
The United Nations suffered 500,000 casualties, more than 33,000 of whom were dead Americans. On the communist side, more than 1.5 million men were wounded or killed, not counting civilians. Tens of thousands of prisoners were taken. In Korea, communist leaders took a bold gamble, believing that the Western powers would not meet force with force. They were mistaken. As a result, communism was encircled by the even stronger democracies, which eventually won the Cold War. From behind the iron and bamboo curtains, secret document by secret document, the truth of the communist Korean War strategy is being revealed. On the Mall in Washington, where visitors gather at memorials to celebrate our past, young and old come to touch the faces of history. A recent memorial rises as though from a rice paddy, stark against the sky. And what of South Korean soldier Donald Chung? He survived, miraculously. When a ceasefire was signed, he looked to the north. Already he'd broken his promise to his mother that he would return within 3 days. Now he realized he could not go back to her at all, or he'd be killed. He looked to the south. There he had no family, nowhere to go. He felt hopeless. Once out of the army, he graduated first in his class from medical school, then headed for the United States.
Exactly September 17, 1962, I landed St. Louis Airport as a 29-year bachelor with a small suitcase and $50 in my pocket.
5 years later, he began a career as a cardiologist. Recently, he wrote a book about his experiences. Many people were touched by his triumph over adversity. To thank the United States and all nations for preserving his life, Dr. Donald Chung gave the entire profits from his book to the Korean War Memorial. His gift of almost $500,000 made him the single largest donor to this symbol of freedom. A line had been drawn and defended. To him and to the thousands who fought and died in Korea, the memorial stands in honor.